Every December, Emma's family set the same table, silver polished, candles flickering, laughter echoing through the house. But at the far end of the table, one chair was always left empty. No plate, no cutlery, no explanation, just a silent chair facing the window, as if waiting for someone who never came home. For years, no one spoke of it, not her parents, not her grandparents. Until tonight, when a yellowed letter marked "For the Table" appears, and its words finally reveal who that chair truly belonged to. Tell me, if your family kept a chair empty every year, would you ask why? Or let the silence continue? Subscribe to Years Ago Stories, because this letter, once opened, will change what that chair means forever. The smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon filled the air as Emma laid out the last fork beside the white linen napkins. Outside, snow gathered quietly along the windowsills, turning the street into a page from an old postcard. It was the night before Christmas Eve, and as always, the family would gather at her parents' house for dinner every year. The same menu, the same laughter, and the same rituals that seemed to have existed forever. But there was one ritual that never made sense to Emma. At the end of the table, her mother had already placed the old oak chair slightly tilted toward the window, polished until it gleamed. Unlike the others, there was no plate, no glass, no folded napkin resting on it. The seat remained bare, waiting for no one. When Emma was little, she thought it was a game, a seat for Santa, maybe, or a trick for good luck. But as she grew older, she noticed the way her mother's hand lingered on the chair each year, her father's eyes softening for a moment before he changed the subject. No one ever sat there, and no one ever explained why. Now, at 30, hosting the holiday for the first time in her own home, Emma found herself repeating the same act without even realizing it. She dragged the chair from the attic, dusted it, and set it at the end of the table, facing the window. It felt wrong to celebrate without it, as if removing the chair would break something sacred. When her parents arrived that evening, her mother, Ruth, stopped in the doorway, eyes immediately finding the chair. For a fleeting moment, her lips parted not in surprise, but in memory. "You brought it," Ruth said softly. Emma nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. It didn't feel right without it. Her father smiled faintly, his eyes drifting to the snow outside. "It never does," he said. No one spoke further. They unpacked the food, arranged candles, and the room filled with the familiar rhythm of preparation, the hum of the oven, the clatter of cutlery, the laughter that stitched years together. But beneath it all, Emma could feel something pulsing, an unspoken heartbeat that belonged to that empty seat. Dinner began as it always did. Plates clanked, stories were retold, and the warmth of the fire painted everyone's faces in gold. Emma sat across from the chair, unable to take her eyes off it. Every so often, she caught her mother glancing there too, not with sadness exactly, but with reverence, as if the space itself carried someone's name. Halfway through dessert, she couldn't take it anymore. "Mom," she said gently, setting her fork down, "why do we still keep it? Who is the chair for?" The table fell quiet. The only sound was the faint crackle from the fireplace. Ruth's gaze didn't lift immediately. She smoothed the tablecloth with slow, deliberate fingers. "It's for someone we never stopped waiting for," she said finally. Her father cleared his throat, his voice rough. "It started before you were born, and before your mother too. Every year, one chair was left empty. No one ever explained it to me, either not fully, but your grandmother used to say that when the time was right, the story would find us." Emma frowned. "The story?" Ruth nodded. "She said we'd know it when it arrived." Before Emma could ask more, her mother reached into her purse and took out a small parcel, a square envelope wrapped in yellowing paper and tied with faded twine. "It came to me after your grandmother passed," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was told to keep it safe until it felt right to open. I never knew what that meant until tonight." Ruth placed the envelope on the table, in front of the empty chair. Its edges were soft, its ink faded, but the handwriting was still clear. For the table. Read when we are ready. Emma stared at it, her pulse echoing in her ears. The room felt smaller, quieter, as if even the house was holding its breath. Her mother's eyes shimmered. Maybe, darling. It's time we found out who's been waiting all these years. Emma's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. The paper was thin, brittle, the kind that seemed to carry time within its folds. Her mother and father watched silently as she untied the twine and carefully slid her finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, folded once. The ink had faded to brown, the handwriting elegant but uneven, the kind written by someone used to letters, not emails or notes. She unfolded it slowly, and as the paper opened, a faint scent of cedar and smoke escaped. Like a ghost of the past finding air again, Emma began to read aloud. To my family, to whoever still sets the table each year. If this letter finds you, then I suppose the world has turned many times since I last sat there. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I was the one who used to sit in that chair. Emma's eyes lifted to her mother in shock. Ruth's lips parted, a silent who forming on them. She continued. I left this house on a winter morning, too proud to say goodbye. I said I'd be home before the snow melted, but I never kept that promise. By the time I realized what I had walked away from, the years had already built walls between us. The fire crackled louder, as if reacting to his confession. Emma's father leaned forward, brow furrowed. Thomas Whitmore, he murmured. That was your grandmother's brother, wasn't it, Ruth? Ruth nodded slowly, eyes glassy. She never spoke of him, only that there had been a fight. She said he left one day and didn't come back. Emma looked back at the page. The next lines were darker, written with a steadier hand, as if the writer had paused before continuing. I fought with my father over something foolish pride, I think. I wanted to make my own way, to prove I could live without the family name. But when I left, I didn't just leave him. I left all of you. I missed weddings, births, and Christmas dinners. I told myself I would return one year, but each year it grew harder. The shame built like snow upon my shoulders. Emma's throat tightened. She could almost see him, a young man standing on a frozen road, suitcase in hand, heart heavy but stubborn. I worked in towns where no one knew me. I sent letters home, but when they came back unopened, I stopped trying. I thought my absence would be forgotten. But then I heard, through a traveler, that my father had passed, and that every Christmas, my mother kept a chair for me at the table. Ruth gasped softly, a hand covering her mouth. So that's where it began, she whispered. The chair, it was for him. Emma continued reading, her voice trembling. I never had the courage to come home. Each year, I told myself, next Christmas. And when I grew too old to travel, I wrote this letter instead. I left it with the neighbor, asking that it be given to my family when I was gone. I don't know how long that will take, but I pray it finds you someday, because that chair doesn't belong to my shame anymore. It belongs to forgiveness. Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks, blurring the ink. If you still keep the chair, let it not be empty in sorrow. Let it remind you that love can outlast even the longest silence. I left my place once, but if you've kept it all this time, then I was never truly gone. Emma's voice broke as she reached the last lines. I am sorry. For every meal missed, for every word unsaid. I love you, and if there's a place beyond this one, I hope it has a table big enough for all of us. When she lowered the paper, the room was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire and the steady rhythm of breathing 3 generations sitting with a ghost who had finally spoken. Her mother whispered, He wrote this 50 years ago, and we kept that chair every year without knowing why. Emma nodded, tears falling freely. We were keeping a promise we didn't even realize existed. Her father reached for the letter, folding it carefully. Then maybe it's time to give him back his seat. He stood, pulled out the empty chair, and placed a single plate in front of it. Beside it, he set a glass of wine. "For Thomas," he said softly. For a long time no one moved. The fire's glow deepened to amber, and the room seemed suspended between centuries. The letter lay on the table, edges curling slightly in the heat, as though breathing along with them. Emma stared at the handwriting, firm yet fragile. Every stroke told of distance, regret, and something even deeper, the desperate wish to be remembered. Her mother finally broke the silence. "When I was a girl," Ruth said softly, "I remember grandmother sitting by the window every Christmas Eve. She'd look at the snow, smile a little, and whisper, 'Maybe this year.' I never knew what she meant." Her father nodded slowly. "I think she was waiting for him. For Thomas." The words sank into Emma's heart like warm water into cold hands. She turned toward the empty chair. Now it no longer looked lonely, it looked patient. Ruth rose from her seat and disappeared into the hallway. When she returned, she was holding an old photo album bound in cracked leather. She laid it open on the table, its pages releasing the faint scent of time, ink, paper, and dust. "There," she said, pointing to a sepia photograph of a young man in uniform. His grin was crooked, his eyes full of mischief. "That's him, Thomas Whitmore. He enlisted right after his argument with his father. He said he was going to see the world." Emma traced the edge of the photo. "He looks like you," she whispered. Ruth smiled through tears. He had the same stubborn streak, too. They turned more pages, family picnics, birthdays, summers at the lake. Then, abruptly, there were none of him. His absence stretched across the album like a missing melody in a song. "After he left," Ruth said, "no one talked about him. Not out of anger, out of pain. My grandmother told me once that silence was easier than hope." Emma frowned. "But she kept the chair." "Yes," Ruth said, eyes glistening. "Because hope has a way of showing up, even when we try to bury it." Emma looked again at the chair, its wood gleaming in the firelight. "It's strange," she murmured. "All this time, I thought it was a symbol of loss, but it was really a symbol of waiting." Her father smiled gently. "Waiting is love's oldest language." They all sat quietly, each lost in thought. Outside, snow continued to fall, blurring the world in white. The window reflected their faces back at them, 3 generations in one empty place, connected by a letter that had traveled across half a century. Ruth reached for the letter again and smoothed it against the tablecloth. "He said it doesn't belong to sorrow anymore," she said softly. "He's right." Emma nodded. "Then maybe we should keep the chair, but not as empty space. Maybe it's time to fill it again." Her father looked at her curiously. "With what?" "With memory," Emma said. "With stories, with everything he missed." She rose and poured a small glass of wine. Her hand didn't shake this time. She placed it carefully before the empty chair and raised her own glass. "To Thomas," she said, "for finding his way home, even if it took 50 years." Ruth and her husband stood beside her, glasses in hand. "To family," Ruth whispered, voice trembling, "and to forgiveness." As they drank, the clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking a moment that felt both ancient and new. Emma felt something ease within her chest, as if a story left unfinished had finally found its ending. Then, as if guided by impulse, she unfolded the linen napkin from beside her plate and placed it neatly on the chair. "Just for tonight," she said with a smile. "He's home." Her mother nodded, tears glimmering like glass. "And maybe, every year from now on, that chair can remind us that love doesn't leave it waits." Emma looked at the fire. The logs cracked softly, sparks floating upward like fading memories. She thought about how easily stories could vanish, how silence could erase names, faces, lives, and she made a quiet promise to herself. "This story won't be forgotten again," she whispered. The next morning, the snow lay heavy on the trees, softening every sound outside the house. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and pine still lingered. Emma padded quietly into the dining room, half expecting to see the chair back in its corner hidden away like a forgotten ornament. But it was still there, right where they had left it. The empty chair now held the folded napkin from the night before, and beside it, the letter rested on the table, its corners curling upward as if it, too, was reaching toward the morning light. Emma sat down across from it, the silence between them no longer hollow but full of something gentle. "Good morning, Uncle Thomas," she whispered, surprising herself with how natural it felt to say it. The sound of her mother's slippers brushed behind her. "You're up early," Emma smiled. "Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about him, about the way he said the chair belongs to forgiveness now." Ruth nodded, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Your grandmother would have liked that." Later that afternoon, while her father shoveled the driveway, Emma and Ruth carefully framed the letter. They used the same oak frame that once held a family portrait of her grandparents. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she slid the parchment beneath the glass. "It's funny," Ruth said softly. "I kept this letter for decades without ever opening it. I thought I was protecting a secret, but maybe I was just afraid of what it would say." Emma adjusted the frame so the light hit the ink perfectly. "And now?" "Now, I think I was keeping it safe until we were ready." She smiled faintly, brushing away a tear. Maybe Thomas was right about timing. Some stories can only be understood when the right people are there to hear them. Emma leaned closer. "Then we'll make sure this story never gets lost again." That evening, the family gathered once more. The fire was smaller, the laughter softer, a kind of quiet that didn't ache anymore. Emma placed the framed letter on a small stand beside the empty chair, turning it slightly so the script caught the glow of the flames. Her young nephew, Noah, tugged at her sleeve. "Aunt Emma," he whispered, "why's that chair empty?" Emma smiled, kneeling down so they were eye level. "It's not empty anymore," she said. "It's full of a story. Do you want to hear it?" Noah nodded eagerly, so she told him not everything, not yet, but enough for him to understand that people can come home even when they're gone. As she spoke, his eyes widened in wonder, and when she finished, he looked at the chair again, his face solemn. "Can I put something there?" he asked. "Of course." Noah thought for a moment, then ran to the mantel and took one of the small wooden soldiers from the Christmas display. He placed it carefully on the chair's arm. "So he won't be alone," he said simply. Ruth pressed her lips together, trying not to cry. "Your grandmother would have loved that," she murmured. As the night deepened, Emma stood by the window, watching the snow continue to fall. Her reflection overlapped with the room behind her, the flickering firelight, her parents' soft voices, the chair with the letter, and the tiny soldier resting beside it. For the first time, she felt that the family's traditions weren't just repetition, they were a language, one that spoke without words. She thought of the generations before her, of all the people who had sat at that table, laughing, arguing, forgiving, and waiting. The chair had carried all of it, the patience of her grandmother, the silence of her mother, the curiosity of a child. It wasn't just furniture. It was a vessel for love that refused to die. Emma whispered to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "We all have our empty chairs, don't we?" And somewhere deep inside her, she felt the quiet answer, "Yes, but they don't have to stay empty forever." The year turned, as it always did. Snow melted into the earth, flowers pushed their way back through the soil, and time moved with quiet certainty. Yet the chair remained each season, each dinner, standing patiently at the far end of the table like an old friend who needed no invitation. Emma kept her promise. She didn't let the story fade. Whenever family visited, she told it again. How Thomas had left, how he had written, how love had waited through half a century of silence. Each retelling softened the ache a little more, turning grief into gratitude. One spring afternoon, she found herself sitting in the garden with her mother, sunlight flickering between the leaves. The letter now hung on the wall inside, next to a framed photograph of Thomas that Ruth had discovered in an attic box. "He looks peaceful there," Emma said. Ruth smiled. Maybe stories finally let people rest once they're told. Emma nodded. Maybe that's what forgiveness really is, letting someone come home, even if it's only in words. Ruth took her hand. And maybe, sweetheart, we keep the chair because every family needs a reminder that love doesn't vanish. It just waits for us to remember it. That Christmas came faster than expected. This time, Emma's house was filled with new voices, cousins, friends, neighbors who had become family. Laughter bounced off the walls, and the table stretched longer than ever before. But at the end, the old oak chair still stood. Its wood gleamed under candlelight. The napkin lay neatly folded on the seat, the small wooden soldier resting on its arm. As everyone settled, Noah, now a little older, a little taller, tugged at Emma's sleeve again. "Can I read the letter this year?" he asked. Emma hesitated, her eyes softening. "Of course you can." She handed him the carefully preserved copy, her heart swelling as he unfolded it with the reverence only a child can give to something ancient. His small voice carried through the room, clear, gentle, and steady. When he reached the words, "If you still keep the chair, let it not be empty in sorrow." Emma looked around the table. There were tears, yes, but also smiles, the kind that bridge decades. When Noah finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat, and then Emma stood, glass in hand. "To the chair," she said, her voice calm but full. "To all the stories that waited to be told, and to the people who taught us that forgiveness doesn't need an audience, just a heart willing to listen." Ruth rose beside her, adding softly, "And to the family that remembers." The sound of glasses meeting filled the air like music. Emma looked around, faces lit by candlelight, the golden flicker of love that had endured generations. For a moment, she imagined Thomas there, seated at the end, smiling quietly as he watched them. Not a ghost, not a regret, just part of the family again. She thought about how many people might be sitting at tables like theirs, chairs left empty for reasons forgotten, silences passed down like heirlooms. Maybe, she thought, someone watching this, someone somewhere, would finally decide to ask the question that begins the healing. When the guests left and the house grew still again, Emma lingered in the dining room. The candles had burned low, the plates stacked neatly. Only the chair remained, bathed in the soft glow of the fire. She placed a small wreath of evergreen across its backrest, not as a symbol of mourning, but of continuity. Then she whispered, "Merry Christmas, Uncle Thomas." A faint creak answered her, the kind a chair makes when someone shifts slightly in their seat. She smiled, closing her eyes. Outside, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the table stood full of laughter, forgiveness, and a story that had finally found its ending. Because sometimes, the most powerful seat in a house isn't the one we fill, it's the one we keep waiting for. Years later, when Emma's hair began to silver and her hands carried the faint tremor of time, the house still held the same table. The wood had darkened with age, the polish dulled by hundreds of meals, but the laughter remained layered in its grain like memory in a heartbeat. The empty chair was no longer empty. It had become part of the room's rhythm, as natural as the ticking of the clock or the creak of the floorboards. Sometimes, guests would ask about it, and Emma would smile, pour them tea, and tell the story once more, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. "It started with a letter," she'd say, unfolding a small replica of the original. "But it became a reminder that we are never truly forgotten, not if someone keeps a place for us." She would point toward the window where snow still liked to gather every winter, as though returning to a promise. "That chair taught us something," she'd add softly. "That love doesn't end when someone leaves the room. It waits, right where you last saw it." When Emma's daughter, Clara, took over the house, she kept the tradition alive. Every holiday, she placed the chair at the end of the table, set a napkin across it, and laid the framed letter nearby. But over time, she added something new, a small notebook with blank pages. "Every year," she told her children, "we'll write a memory of someone who isn't here, not because they're gone, but because they live in our stories. And so, each December, the family gathered around, writing lines in careful handwriting. For Grandpa, who taught me to dance in the kitchen. For Aunt Ruth, who laughed even when it rained. For Thomas, who found his way home through words. By the time the notebook was full, the table had become something more than furniture. It was a map of belonging, a place where names, laughter, and silence wove together like threads in the same tapestry. One winter evening, when the snow fell just as thick as the night the letter was opened decades before, Clara's son, now grown, was closing up the dining room after another family gathering. The fire had dimmed to embers, the room whispering its quiet end-of-night hush. As he reached to blow out the final candle, he noticed something strange. The chair, slightly turned toward the table, as if someone had just risen from it. He paused. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a figure, a man, faint and golden in the candlelight, smiling with pride. But when he blinked, it was gone. Still, he didn't feel afraid, only peaceful. He placed his hand on the chair's backrest and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, carrying the glow of the house into the night. Years would pass, and people would move, and homes would change. But the story of the empty chair traveled with them across towns, across oceans. Family members who had never met Thomas still spoke his name, as though it were part of a prayer. The original letter now rested in a museum in the small town where Emma's grandparents once lived, framed behind glass, labeled "A Letter to the Table." Visitors stopped to read it, and many left with quiet tears in their eyes. Somewhere, in countless homes, others began setting chairs too, not for ghosts, but for the memories that shaped them. And maybe, just maybe, in the stillness of those rooms, the echo of Thomas's words found its way back. If you still keep the chair, let it not be empty in sorrow. Let it remind you that love can outlast even the longest silence. And so it did. Every creak of wood, every clink of glass, every story retold at a winter table, all of it became part of that single truth. We never truly lose the people we remember. We only learn new ways to keep their seat warm. Have you ever had an empty chair in your heart, someone or something you still keep space for? Share your story below. Your memory might be the one someone else needs to hear. Subscribe to Years Ago Stories and keep the warmth of these stories alive. Because every family has a tale that deserves to be told before it's forgotten.